It's most peculiar. 130. It is quite simple. The Icelanders often carry weapons like this, and Hans must be its owner, and have dropped it. 131. I shook my head. Hans had never had this knife on him. Is it then the weapon of some warrior from before the flood? I exclaimed, of a living human being, of a contemporary of that gigantic shepherd. But it can't be. It isn't from the Stone Age. Not even the Bronze Age. This blade is made of steel. My uncle stopped me dead on this track where a new diversion was leading me, saying in his cold tone, "Calm down, Axel, and use your head. This knife is from the 16th century, it is an authentic dagger, like the ones that nobles used to carry on their belts for giving the coup de grace. It is of Spanish manufacture. It belongs neither to me, nor to you, nor to the hunter, nor even to the human beings that may live in these bowels of the earth." 132. Do you mean? Look, this blade has not become so notched by sinking into people's throats, and it is covered in a layer of rust, more than a day thick, more than a year, more than a century even. 128. But, again, 1864 edition, but certainly, by working our way along the coast, we'll get near Port Grouben again. 129. It's recognized. This paragraph contains 3 very minor changes from the 1864 edition. 130. Most peculiar. 131. It dropped it. This paragraph was ascribed to Axel rather than Liedenbrock in the 1864 edition, and has also undergone 4 minor textual changes. 132. Nor even the earth. These words were added in the 1867 edition. From this point onwards, the 2 editions are identical, with the exception of 1 punctuation mark changed in the 6th paragraph following. The professor, as usual, was getting excited as his imagination ran away with him. "Axel, we are on the path of a great discovery. This blade has been laying on the sand for 1, 2, 300 years, and it is scored because it was used on the rocks of this subterranean sea. But it couldn't have just arrived on its own. It couldn't have got twisted by itself. Somebody must have got here before us. Yes, a man. Who? The man who used this knife to engrave his name. His aim was once more to mark the route to the center with his own hand. Let's see if we can find it." We excitedly worked our way along the high cliffs, looking for the smallest clefts that might turn into a gallery. We eventually came to a place where the shore got narrower. The sea came nearly to the foot of the cliffs, leaving us at most 2 yards to pass. Between 2 projecting rocks loomed the entrance of a dark tunnel. There, on a slab of granite, 2 mysterious letters were carved, half worn away, the twin initials of the bold and fantastic traveler, A.S., cried my uncle. "Arn Saknussemm once again." 40. Since the beginning of our journey I had been astonished many times. I would have thought that I was immune to surprise and blasé at any new wonder. Nevertheless, at the sight of the 2 letters engraved on this spot 3 centuries previously, I felt an amazement which came close to stupor. Not only could the signature of the learned alchemist be read clearly on the rock, but I had in my hand the stylus with which he had traced it. Unless I was completely dishonest with myself, I could no longer doubt the existence of the traveler or the truth of his journey. While these thoughts whirled through my brain, Professor Leidenbrock was indulging in a slightly excessive praise of Arne Saknussemm. "Oh, marvelous genius! You did everything to open up to other mortals the way through the crust of the earth, and now your comrades can follow the traces your feet left in these dark underpasses 300 years ago. You intended these marvels to be contemplated by eyes other than your own. Your name, engraved on the successive stages of the route, leads the traveler bold enough to follow you straight to his goal, and it will be found yet again at the very center of our planet, once more carved by your own hand. Well, I too intend to sign my name on this, the last of the granite pages. But henceforth let this cape, first seen by you on this sea, first discovered by you, be known as Cape Saknussemm." This, or something like it, was what I heard, and I felt won over myself by the enthusiasm conveyed in such words. An inner fire rekindled in my breast. I forgot everything, even the dangers of the downward journey and the perils of the return. What another had done I wished to do too, and nothing that was human seemed impossible to me. Forward, forward. I was already making my headlong way towards the dark gallery, when I was stopped. The professor, the one who normally got carried away, was recommending calm and patience. "Let's first go and find Hans, and then bring the raft over here." I obeyed, not with any great pleasure, and slipped back between the rocks on shore. "Have you thought, uncle?" I said as we walked. "We've been very lucky so far, haven't we?" "Oh, do you think so?" "Yes, even the storm helped put us on the right track again. Thank God it happened. It brought us back to this coast, which wouldn't have happened if we'd had fine weather. Imagine for a moment that our prow, in so far as a raft can be said to have a prow, had touched the southern coastline of the Leidenbrock Sea. What would have become of us? We wouldn't have seen Saknussemm's name, and we would now be washed up on a shore that offered no way out. Yes, Axel, there is something providential in the fact that, sailing southwards, we should have come north and returned to Cape Saknussem. Indeed, it seems to me more than astonishing, and there is something here that I can't begin to explain. Well, it doesn't really matter. What counts is to make use of the facts, not explain them. No doubt, my boy, but now we are about to head north again, passing under the countries of northern Europe, under Sweden, even under Siberia for all I know. We're not going to plunge under the deserts of Africa or the breakers of the ocean. That's all I need to know. Yes, you are right. Everything is for the best, since we are going to leave this horizontal sea which was taking us nowhere. Now we shall go down, then further down, and then down again. Do you realize that we have less than 3,900 miles left to cover? Bah, hardly worth mentioning. Off we go, come on. This insane conversation was still continuing as we joined up again with the hunter. Everything was ready for leaving immediately. All the packages were on board the raft. We embarked, hoisted the sail, and Hans steered us along the coast towards Cape Saknussem. The wind direction was not very favorable for a kind of vessel unable to tack against it. As a result, quite often we had to use the iron-tipped staves to move forward. The rocks, lurking under the surface, often forced us into long detours. Finally, after 3 hours navigation, at about 6 p.m., we reached a suitable spot for landing. I sprang ashore, followed by my uncle and the Icelander. The crossing had not calmed me down. I even suggested burning our boats so as to cut off all possibility of retreat. But my uncle disagreed. I found him singularly half-hearted. At least let's set off without wasting a moment. Yes, my boy, but first we should have a look at this new gallery, to decide whether we need to get the ladders ready. My uncle switched on his Ruhmkorff lamp. The raft, moored on the shore, was left to its own devices. The mouth of the gallery was less than 20 yards away, and our little expedition, with myself as leader, headed for it without delay. The opening, more or less round, was about 5 feet in diameter. The dark tunnel was cut in the living rock, and had been carefully bored by the eruptive substance that had passed through it. Its floor was at the same level as the ground, so that you could enter it without problem. We were following an almost horizontal path when, after only about 20 feet, our way forward was blocked by an enormous obstruction. Blasted rock! I cried, seeing myself abruptly frustrated by an insuperable obstacle. In vain did we search to left and right, above and below. There was no passage, no alternative path. I felt bitterly disappointed, and could not accept that the barrier existed. I stooped down, and looked under the massive block. Not even a crack. On top of it, the same granite barrier. Hans shone the light from the lamp on every part of the wall covering, but it was perfectly continuous everywhere. Any hope of getting through had to be given up. I sat on the bare ground. My uncle was pacing up and down with great strides. But what about Saknussem? I cried. Yes, was he stopped by a stone door? No. This piece of rock must be there because of some earthquake or other, or one of those magnetic phenomena that shake the Earth's crust. The passage must have been suddenly closed off. A good many years passed between Saknussem's return and the fall of the rock. Isn't it obvious that this gallery was formerly the route the lava took, and that the eruption flowed freely along it? Look, there are recent cracks running along this granite ceiling. The roof is made of pieces swept along, of enormous boulders, as if the hand of some giant had labored to build it. But one day, the vertical pressure became too strong, and this block, like the keystone of a vault, fell to the ground and blocked off the whole passage. This is a chance obstacle that Saknussem didn't meet, and if we can't beat it, we don't deserve to get to the center of the world. That was the way I spoke. The professor's entire soul had passed into me. The spirit of discovery was arousing me. I forgot about the past, I didn't care about the future. I had submerged myself in the bosom of that spheroid, and nothing existed for me on its surface, not the towns or the countryside, not Hamburg or Königstrasse, not even my poor Grauben, who must have thought that I was lost forever in the bowels of the earth. Come on, said my uncle, using the pickaxes and ice picks, let's force our route, let's knock down these walls. It's too hard for the pickaxes. An ice pick then. It's too deep for an ice pick. But, well then, the powder, an explosion. Let's mine the obstacle and blow it up. Blow it up. Yes, it's only a bit of rock to break up. Hans, to work, shouted my uncle. The Icelander went back to the raft, and soon returned with one of the pickaxes, which he used to hollow out a cavity for the explosive. It was not an easy task. He had to make a hole big enough to hold 50 pounds of guncotton, whose explosive force is 4 times as great as gunpowder's. I was in an extreme state of excitement. While Hans worked, I devoutly helped my uncle to prepare a long fuse made of damp gunpowder wrapped in a canvas tube. We'll get through. We'll get through, repeated my uncle. At midnight, our work as miners was complete, the guncotton charge was crammed into the hole in the rock, and the fuse unwound through the gallery to the outside. A spark was now enough to set off this imposing device. Till tomorrow then, said the professor. I had to resign myself to waiting for 6 long hours. 41 The following day, Thursday the 27th of August, was an important one in our underground journey. Every time that I think about it now, terror makes my heart beat faster. From that moment on, our reason, our judgment, our ingenuity were to have no influence at all on events, we were to become the mere playthings of the earth. We were up by 6. The time had come to use explosives to force a way through the granite crust. I requested the honor of lighting the fuse. Afterwards I would rejoin my companions on the raft, which had not yet been unloaded, then we would head out for the open sea, so as to reduce the danger from the explosion, which could easily affect an area well beyond the outcrop. According to our calculations, the fuse would burn for 10 minutes before setting off the powder chamber. So I had plenty of time to get back to the raft. But it was not without a certain trepidation that I got ready to play my part. After a hurried breakfast, my uncle and the hunter went on board the raft while I remained on shore. I was equipped with a lighted lantern for setting off the fuse. It's time to go, Axel, said my uncle, but do make sure you come straight back afterwards. Don't worry, I'm not going to hang around. I made straight for the mouth. I opened the lantern and picked up the end of the fuse. The professor had his chronometer in his hand. Ready, he shouted. Ready. Well, fire away, my lad. I pushed the fuse quickly into the flame and it spluttered into life as I sprinted back to the shore. Get on, said my uncle, and we'll head out. With a forceful shove, Hans pushed us off. The raft moved 40 yards out. It was a tense moment. The professor was watching the hand of the chronometer. 5 more minutes. 4, 3. My heart beat every half second. 2, 1. Take that, oh granite mountains. What happened next? I don't think I actually heard the noise of the explosion. But the shapes of the rocks suddenly changed before my eyes, they swung away like curtains. I glimpsed an unfathomable void hollowed out from the very shore. The sea, seized with dizziness, had become nothing but one immense wave, on whose back the raft rose straight up. The 3 of us were thrown down. Within a second, light had given way to the most utter darkness. Then I felt the solid support disappearing, not beneath my feet but under the raft itself. I thought for a moment that it was sinking, but soon realized that it couldn't be. I tried to speak to my uncle, but the bellowing of the waters stopped him from hearing me. Despite the darkness, the noise, the surprise, and the excitement, I soon understood what had happened. On the other side of the blown-up outcrop was an abyss. The explosion had set off a sort of earthquake in the already shattered ground, a chasm had opened up, and the sea, transformed into a great river, had carried us down into it. I thought we were lost. 1 hour, 2 hours, how could I tell, went by in this way. We linked arms, we held each other's hands so as not to be thrown off the raft. It jolted with great violence whenever it touched the side. Such collisions were infrequent, however, and hence I deduced that the gallery was getting considerably larger. There could be no doubt that this was Saknussemm's route, but instead of following it on our own, our carelessness had brought down an entire sea with us. It will be understood that these ideas crossed my mind in indistinct and murky form. Any association of ideas was difficult during this dizzy descent, more like free fall. To tell from the air whipping past my face, the speed must have been greater than the fastest trains. Lighting a torch would have been impossible in such conditions, and our last electrical apparatus had been broken at the time of the explosion. I was therefore quite surprised suddenly to see a light beside me. Hans's calm face appeared. The adroit hunter had managed to light the lantern, and although the flame flickered and almost went out, it threw some rays into the awful blackness. As I thought, the gallery was a wide one, for the light was not strong enough to reveal both walls at the same time. The slope of the water bearing us on was greater than that of the most insurmountable rapids in America. Its surface was as if made up of sheaves of liquid arrows let loose with total power. I cannot describe what I felt with any more precise comparison. When the raft got caught in eddies, it was swept on while turning slowly round. When it went near the walls of the gallery, I shone the lantern on them, and got some idea of our speed from seeing the projections of the rocks as continuous lines, so that we were hemmed in by a network of moving streaks. I estimated our speed to be as much as 55 miles an hour. My uncle and I looked at each other with wild eyes, leaning back on the stump of the mast, which had broken in half during the catastrophe. We faced away from the air so as to avoid being suffocated by the speed of a motion that no human power could influence. But the hours went by. The basic situation remained the same, even if an incident arose to complicate it. While trying to put our cargo in some kind of order, I discovered that most of the possessions on board had disappeared when the sea had attacked us so violently at the time of the explosion. I wished to know the exact position of our resources, so began a search while holding up the lantern. Of our instruments only the compass and chronometer remained. The ladders and ropes consisted of a mere end of a cable coiled around the stump of the mast. Not a single pickaxe, not an ice pick, not a hammer, and, worse still, food for only one more day. I searched amongst the cracks in the raft, in the smallest gaps between the beams and the joints. Nothing. Our provisions amounted to one piece of dried meat and a few dried biscuits. I looked at them blankly, not wanting to understand. And yet what was the danger I was worrying about? Even had the victuals been enough for months or years, how could we get back out of the chasm that this inexorable river was carrying us into? What was the point of worrying about hunger pains, when death was possible in so many other ways? Would we not have plenty of time to die of inanition? Nevertheless, by a mysterious trick of the mind, I forgot about the immediate danger, for those of the future appeared to me in all their horror. In any case, perhaps we could escape the river's fury and get back to the globe's surface. How, I did not know. Where, didn't make any difference. A chance in 1,000 is still a chance, while death through starvation left us no possibility of hope, not the least prospect. I thought of telling my uncle everything, of showing him how few things we had left, of calculating exactly how much time we still had to live. But I had the strength to remain silent. I wanted him to retain all his self-control. At this moment the lantern slowly dimmed, and then went out altogether. The wick had burned through, and total blackness ensued. There was no point in trying to reduce this impenetrable inkiness. We still had one torch left, but it wouldn't have stayed alight. So, like a child, I closed my eyes to shut out all the darkness. After quite a long time, our speed got much faster, as I realized from the battering of air on my face. The angle of the water got worse. We no longer seemed to be sliding, but falling. I had the clear sensation of a near vertical drop. My uncle's and Hans's hands, clamped on my arms, held firmly onto me. After an indeterminate period, something like a sudden shock happened. The raft hadn't collided with a hard object, but it had abruptly stopped falling. A waterspout, a huge liquid column, crashed down over the raft. I was suffocating. I was drowning. However, this flood did not last long. After a few seconds, I found myself gulping air down again. My uncle and Hans were gripping my arms as if to break them, and the raft was still bearing the three of us on. 42. It must have been about 10 p.m. The first of my senses to start working after the last attack was that of hearing. Almost straight away I heard, and this was a definite event, I heard silence falling in the gallery, replacing the roaring which had been filling my ears for so many hours. Words from my uncle finally reached me like a murmur. "We're going up." "What do you mean?" I shouted. "We're climbing. We're actually climbing." I stretched out my arm, I touched the wall, my hand got blood on it. We were rising very fast. The torch. Hans finally managed to light it, and the flame, burning upwards despite our movement, spread enough light to reveal the scene. Exactly as I thought. We are in a narrow shaft, only 30 feet wide. When the water reached the bottom of the chasm, it started coming back up, taking us with it. Where to? I do not know, but we will have to be ready for any eventuality. I estimated our speed to be 13 feet per second, 780 feet per minute, or more than 14 miles per hour. At this rate, one can go places. Yes, if nothing stops us and if the shaft has a way out. But if it's blocked, if the air gets more and more compressed by the pressure from the water column, we are about to be crushed to death. Axel, replied the professor very calmly. The situation is virtually hopeless, but there exists a possibility of salvation, and it is that possibility which I am examining. If we may die at any moment, we may also at any moment be saved. Let us accordingly be ready to seize the slightest opportunity. But what can be done? Maintain our strength by eating. At these words I looked at my uncle distraught. I had not been able to confess before, but now it had to be done, eating. Yes, without delay. The professor said a few words in Danish. Hans shook his head. What? Shouted my uncle. Has something happened to our food? Yes, this is what is left, one piece of dried meat for the three of us. My uncle looked at me as if trying to understand my words. Well, I said, do you still think we might be saved? My question received no answer. An hour passed. I began to feel a violent hunger. My companions were suffering as well, but not one of us dared touch the pathetic remains of the food. We were still rising very fast. Sometimes the air stopped us breathing properly, as it does with aeronauts who ascend too quickly. But while aeronauts are subject to cold proportional to their height amongst the layers of the atmosphere, we were undergoing the diametrically opposite effect. The temperature was rising worryingly and had easily reached 40 degrees Celsius. What did such a change mean? Until now Leidenbrock and Davies' theory had been confirmed by the evidence. Until now special conditions of refracting rocks, of electricity, or of magnetism had modified the general laws of nature, making the heat stay moderate. Given that the theory of a central fire remained in my view the only correct one, the only justifiable one, were we going to return to an environment where this phenomenon held true, where the heat completely melted the rocks? I was afraid so, and said to the professor, if we aren't drowned or torn to pieces, if we don't starve to death, there's still the chance we might be burned alive. He merely shrugged his shoulders and returned to his thoughts. An hour passed without anything happening apart from a slight increase in the temperature. At last my uncle said something. Look, he said, we must decide. Decide. Yes. We must keep up our strength. If we try to extend our lives for a few more hours by eking out what is left of the food, then we will remain weak until the end. Yes, till the end, which isn't far off. Well then, should a chance of salvation occur, should action become necessary, where will we find the strength to act if we let ourselves be weakened by inanition? But, uncle, when we've eaten this piece of meat, what will we have left? Nothing, Axel, nothing. But will devouring it with your eyes give you any more nourishment? Your arguments are those of a man with no will, a being without energy. Then you've still not given up. I shouted irritably. No. He replied firmly. What? You still think we have a chance of being saved? Yes, most certainly. And while his heart still beats, while his flesh still moves, I cannot accept that a being endowed with willpower can give in to despair. What words! The man who pronounced them in such circumstances was clearly of no ordinary metal. But what do you suggest? We eat every last scrap of food and get our strength back. All right, so this meal will be our last. But at least, instead of being exhausted, we will be men again. Well, what are we waiting for? My uncle took the piece of meat and the few biscuits that had survived the shipwreck, divided them into 3 equal parts, and handed them out. This produced about a pound of food each. The professor ate hungrily, with a sort of feverish abandon, myself without pleasure despite my hunger, almost with disgust, Hans quietly, moderately, soundlessly chewing small mouthfuls, savoring them with the calm of a man the problems of the future cannot worry. By looking everywhere, he had found half a flask of gin, he passed it over, and this beneficial liquid revived me slightly. Fortrafelig, said Hans, drinking in turn. Excellent, replied my uncle. I had found some hope again. But we had just finished our last meal. It was 5 in the morning. Man is made in such a way that his health has a purely negative effect. Once his need to eat has been satisfied, he finds it difficult to imagine the horrors of hunger. To understand them he has to experience them. Consequently, after a long period without food, a few mouthfuls of meat and biscuit overcame our previous gloom. Afterwards, each of us was lost in his thoughts. What was Hans dreaming about, this man from the extreme west, but ruled by the fatalistic resignation of the east? For my part all my thoughts were memories, bringing me back to that surface of the globe which I should never have left. The house in Königstrasse, my poor Grauben, Martha the maid, passed before my eyes like visions, and in the sad rumblings coming through the rocks, I thought I could hear the towns of this earth. As for my uncle, always the professional, he was holding up the torch and carefully studying the nature of the formations. He was trying to discover where we were from the successive strata. This calculation, or Rothair estimation, could at best be highly approximate, but a scholar remains a scholar, at least when he manages to retain his self-control, and Professor Leidenbrock certainly possessed this last quality to an extraordinary degree. I heard him murmuring words from the science of geology. I understood them and could not help being interested in this final piece of work. Eruptive granite, he was saying. We're still in the primitive period, but we're climbing. Who knows? Who knows? He had not given up hope. He touched the walls and a few moments later continued, nice, mica schists. Good. We will soon be in the transition period, and then. What did the professor mean? Could he measure the thickness of the Earth's crust above our heads? Did he have a single justification for his calculation? No, he had no manometer and no estimation could take its place. Meanwhile the temperature was increasing tremendously and I could feel myself bathing in a burning atmosphere. I could only compare it to the heat given off by the furnaces of a foundry when the metal is being poured out. By degrees Hans, my uncle, and I had taken off our jackets and waistcoats. The least garment caused us discomfort, even pain. Are we moving towards a fiery furnace? I called out at a moment when the heat was getting much worse. No, replied my uncle, it is not possible. It is not possible. All the same, I said, testing the wall, it feels burning hot. As I said these words, my hand touched the surface of the water, but I had to draw it back quickly. The water is boiling, I exclaimed. This time the professor replied only with an angry gesture. An invincible terror then took hold of my mind and would not let go. I felt that a catastrophe was soon going to happen, one that the most daring of imaginations could not conceive. An idea that was at first vague and doubtful slowly became a certainty in my mind. I rejected it, but it came obstinately back, again and again. I did not dare put it into words. But a number of involuntary observations convinced me. In the flickering light from the torch, I noticed convulsions in the granite strata. A phenomenon was clearly going to happen in which electricity had a role, but this terrible heat, the boiling water. I decided to look at the compass. It had gone mad. 43, yes, mad. The needle was jumping from one pole to the other with sharp jerks, working its way through every point of the compass, spinning as if completely dizzy. I knew that, according to the generally accepted theories, the Earth's mineral crust is never in a complete state of rest. The changes caused by the decomposition of internal substances, the vibrations produced by the larger sea currents, and the actions of the magnetic forces all tend to shake it around constantly, although the creatures living on the surface have no idea that it is moving. This phenomenon on its own, therefore, would not specially have frightened me, or at least would not normally have produced a terrible suspicion. But further phenomena, sending clues unlike any others, could no longer be ignored. Explosions were occurring with an increasing and alarming intensity. I could only compare them with the sound of dozens of carts being driven hard over cobblestones. Their thundering was continuous. The compass, shaken madly around by the electrical phenomena, also helped me make up my mind. The mineral crust was threatening to break up, the granite masses to come together, the chasm to be plugged, the void to be filled in, and we poor molecules were going to be crushed in the harrowing embrace that resulted. Uncle, we've had it. What is this new panic? He answered surprisingly calmly. What is the matter with you? The matter? Look at the walls moving, this rock which is falling apart, this scorching heat, this boiling water, this thickening steam, this crazy needle, all signs of an impending earthquake. My uncle gently shook his head. An earthquake? Yes. I think, my boy, that you are mistaken. What? Don't you realize that these symptoms of an earthquake? No, I am expecting something better than that. What do you mean? I'm hoping for an eruption, Axel. An eruption? We can't possibly be in the vent of an active volcano, can we? I think we are, said the professor, smiling. It is the best thing that could have happened to us. The best thing. Had my uncle gone quite mad? What did his words mean? How could he be so calm and happy? What? I cried. We're in the middle of an eruption. Fate has placed us in the path of red-hot lava, fiery rocks, boiling water, of all the substances that are thrown up in eruptions. We are to be expelled, thrown out, rejected, regurgitated, spat out into the air, in a whirlwind of flame, along with huge amounts of rock and showers of ash and scoria. And that's the best thing that could happen to us. Yes, said the professor, looking at me over the top of his glasses. For it is the only chance we have of getting back to the surface of the earth. I will skip the myriad ideas that intersected in my brain in that single moment. My uncle was right, absolutely right, and never had he seemed more fearless or more self-assured than at this moment, when calmly waiting, calculating the chances of an eruption. Meanwhile we had continued rising, the night went by without any change, only the noise all around became louder and louder. I was almost suffocating. I thought my last hour had come, and yet, imagination being such a strange thing, I gave in to truly childish thoughts. But I couldn't help my ideas, I had no control over them. It was clear that we were being pushed upwards by the force of an eruption. Under the raft there was turbulent, boiling water, and under that a whole sticky mass of lava, a huge conglomeration of rocks. When they got to the top of the crater, they would be thrown out in all directions. We were in the vent of a volcano. Of that there could be no doubt. But this time, instead of the extinct Snaefels, we were dealing with a volcano in full activity. I was wondering therefore what mountain it could possibly be, and which part of the world we were going to be thrown out onto. Some northern region, of course. Before it had gone insane, the compass had been consistently pointing in that direction. Since leaving Cape Saknussemm, we had been swept due north for hundreds and hundreds of miles. Were we underneath Iceland once more? Were we to be ejected from the crater of Mount Hekla 133 or one of the 7 other volcanoes on the island? Otherwise, within a radius of 1,200 miles and at that latitude, I could only think of the little-known volcanoes on the northwest coast of America. To the east, there was only one at less than 80 degrees north, esk, in Jan Mayen, not far from Spitzbergen. 134. On the other hand, there was no general lack of craters, and they all had plenty of room to spew out a whole army. I tried to guess which one would serve as our exit. Towards morning our ascent became still faster. The heat was increasing rather than decreasing as we approached the surface of the globe. This had to be a local effect due to the influence of some volcano. No longer could there be any doubt at all as to our means of transport. An enormous force, a pressure of several hundred atmospheres produced by the steam built up in the Earth's breast, was irresistibly thrusting up at us. But how many terrible dangers would it expose us to? Soon wild glowing lights shone on the walls of the vertical chimney, which was now widening out. On either side I could see deep corridors, like immense tunnels, sending forth thick steam and smoke, while tongues of flame crackled and licked at the walls. Look, uncle. Yes, sulfur flames. Nothing could be more normal during an eruption. But what if they come and attack us? They won't. And what if we suffocate? We shan't. The shaft is getting wider. If necessary we can get off the raft and take shelter in some fissure. But the water. Rising all the time. There is no water left, Axel, just a viscous lava stream which is lifting us up on its way to the mouth of the crater. 133 Mount Hekla, near Myrtles Jökull, S. Iceland, famous throughout the Middle Ages as a gateway to hell. Major eruption in 1104. 134 Esk, in Jan Mayen, not far from Spitzbergen, in fact several hundred miles away. The volcano on this island, which is extinct, does not seem to be called Esk, whereas there is an Esk in Alaska. It was true that the water had disappeared, replaced by relatively dense eruptive matter, which was boiling, however. The temperature was becoming unbearable. A thermometer would have indicated more than 70 degrees. I was bathed in sweat. But for the speed of the climb, we would certainly have been suffocated. The professor did not pursue his suggestion of leaving the raft, which was perhaps just as well. Those few beams, roughly joined together, gave us a solid base, which we wouldn't have had anywhere else. Towards 8 in the morning a new incident happened for the first time. The upward movement stopped all of a sudden, with the raft remaining absolutely motionless. What's happening? I asked, shaken by this abrupt halt as if the raft had hit something. An intermission. Is the eruption slowing down? I sincerely hope not. I stood up. I tried to look around. Perhaps the raft had caught against a sticking out rock and was momentarily holding back the flow of the eruptive material. If so, it ought to be freed at once. But this wasn't the case. The column of ashes, scoria, rocks, and debris had itself stopped rising. Is the eruption stopping? Ah, said my uncle through clenched teeth. So that's what you are worrying about, my boy. But don't fret, this can only be a temporary lull. It has already lasted 5 minutes, and in a short while we shall be heading towards the mouth of the crater once again. While speaking, the professor consulted his chronometer, and he was soon proved right in this prediction too. The raft was once more caught up in a rapid, disorderly flux, which lasted for about 2 minutes, then stopped again. Good, said my uncle, noting the time. It will restart in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Yes. We are dealing with a volcano whose eruption is periodic. It lets us breathe when it does. He was absolutely correct. At the allotted time we were shot upwards again with great speed. We had to cling onto the beams or we would have been thrown off the raft. Then the thrust stopped once more. Since that time, I have often thought about this remarkable phenomenon, but without being able to find a satisfactory explanation for it. Nevertheless, it seems clear to me that we can't have been in the principal chimney of the volcano, but rather a side passage, where there was some sort of counter effect. How many times the process took place, I cannot say. All I can be certain of is that, each time the movement was repeated, we were hurled forward with increasing force, as if lifted by an actual projectile. During the pauses, we suffocated. When we were moving, the burning air took my breath away. For a moment I thought of the ecstasy of suddenly finding myself in the polar regions, at a temperature of -30 degrees. In my overstimulated imagination I wandered over the snowy plains of the Arctic ice cap, and longed for the moment when I could roll on the frozen carpet of the pole. But gradually my head, confused by the repeated shocks, gave up working altogether. If it had not been for Hans's arms, my skull would have been flung against the granite wall on more than one occasion. As a consequence I have no clear memory of what happened during the next few hours. I have a confused memory of endless blasts, of earth movements, of a swirling motion which grabbed hold of the raft. Our vessel rose and fell on the waves of lava, amidst a rain of ashes. It was besieged by roaring flames. An eager gale, as if coming from some immense ventilator, added to the subterranean fires. One last time, Hans's face appeared to me in the light from the blaze. My last thought was the horrifying tragedy of the criminal fastened to the mouth of a cannon, at the moment that the shot goes off and sends his arms and legs flying into the air. 44 When I opened my eyes again, I felt the strong hand of the guide clutching my belt. With the other he was holding on to my uncle. I was not seriously injured, merely bruised and aching all over. I saw that I was lying on the slope of a mountain, only a few feet away from a precipice which I would have fallen into with the slightest movement. Hans had clearly saved me from certain death while I was rolling down the flanks of the crater. Where are we? Asked my uncle, who looked highly annoyed to be back on Earth again. The guide shrugged his shoulders as if to show he didn't know. In Iceland, I ventured. Nay, answered Hans. What does he mean, no? Cried the professor. He must be wrong, I said, getting up. After the many surprises of the journey, another was waiting for us. I expected to see a cone covered with eternal snows, in the midst of the arid deserts of the north, under the pale rays of the polar heavens, beyond the furthest latitudes. But, contrary to what I had expected, my uncle, the Icelander, and I were stretched out halfway up a mountain baked by the heat of the sun, which was scorching us with its rays. I wasn't prepared to believe my eyes, but the indisputable burning my body was receiving brooked no reply. We had come out of the crater half naked, and the radiant orb, of which we had asked nothing for 2 months, was now bestowing on us floods of heat and light, was pouring onto us waves of a splendid irradiation. When my eyes had adjusted to this unaccustomed dazzle, I used them to make up for the failure of my imagination. At the very least, I was determined to be in Spitzbergen. I was not in the mood for giving up easily. The professor found his voice first. It certainly doesn't look very much like Iceland. Jan Mayen. I tried. Hardly, my boy. This is not a northern volcano with granite peaks and a crown of snow. And yet, just look, Axel, look. Above our heads, not more than 500 feet away, was the crater of the volcano. Every quarter of an hour there came flying from it a tall column of flames mixed with pumice stone, ashes, and lava, together with a deafening explosion. I felt the whole mountain heave every time it breathed, sending out, like a whale, fire and air through its enormous blowholes. Below, on a steep slope, layers of eruptive material could be seen stretching 700 or 800 feet down, meaning that the volume canoe couldn't be more than 2,000 feet high. Its base was hidden by a real basket of green trees, amongst which I distinguished olive and fig trees plus vines laden with purple grapes. It didn't look much like the Arctic, I had to admit. When one's gaze passed beyond the ring of greenery, it soon went astray on the waters of an exquisite sea or lake, which made this enchanted land and island only a few miles wide. On the eastern side appeared a little port, with a few houses grouped round it and boats of an unusual type rocking on the gentle swell of the turquoise ripples. Beyond, clusters of small islets rose from the liquid plain, in such great numbers as to resemble a huge anthiep. In the west, rounded shores appeared on the distant horizon. On some lay blue mountains of harmonious contours, on others, still further away, appeared measureless cones, above whose high summits floated plumes of smoke. To the north, a broad expanse of water sparkled in the sun's rays, revealing here and there the top of a mast or a convex sail swelling in the wind. That such a panorama was totally unexpected made it infinitely more wonderful and beautiful. Where can we be, oh where? I murmured. Hans shut his eyes in indifference, and my uncle stared uncomprehendingly. Whatever this mountain is, he said at last, it is rather hot. The explosions are still continuing, and it would really not be worth coming out of an eruption, only to have one's head crushed by a falling rock. So let's go down and discover what we're up against. Besides, I am dying of hunger and thirst. The professor was certainly not a contemplative. For my part, I could have stayed hours longer on that spot, forgetting all needs and fatigues, but was obliged to follow my companions down. The slopes of the volcano proved very steep. We slipped into veritable quicksands of ashes, avoiding the lava streams winding down the sides like fiery serpents. While we worked our way down, I talked a great deal, for my imagination was too full not to go off in words. We're in Asia, on the coast of India, in the Malay archipelago, or in the middle of the South Seas. We have gone right across the earth, and come out at the Antipodes. And the compass? Asked my uncle. Oh, the compass, I said with embarrassment. If we listened to what it said, we would think we'd headed north all the time. So it lied. Lied. Not exactly. Then this is the North Pole. No, not actually the pole, but there was something that was indeed difficult to explain. I no longer knew what to think. Meanwhile we were getting near the greenery which had looked so inviting. I was tormented by thirst and hunger. Fortunately, after 2 hours' march, a beautiful countryside came into view, completely covered with olive trees, pomegranates, and vines which seemed to belong to no one in particular. Besides, in our beggarly state, we were not inclined to be choosers. What ecstasy we felt pressing these delicious fruits to our lips, and biting whole clusters off the purple vines. Not far off, amongst the grass under the delicious shade of the trees, I found a spring of fresh water. It was bliss to plunge our hands and faces into it. While we were still enjoying a well-earned rest, a boy appeared between two clumps of olives. So, I cried. An inhabitant of this blessed country. He was a poor little creature, very badly clothed, rather sickly, and apparently much alarmed by our appearance. Indeed, half naked as we were, with our untidy beards, we must certainly have presented a bizarre spectacle. Unless this was a country of robbers, we were likely to frighten the natives. Just as the urchin was about to run away, Hans darted after him and brought him back, ignoring the kicks and screams. My uncle began by calming him down as well as he could, and then inquired in good German, "What is the name of this mountain, my little friend?" The child did not answer. "Good," said my uncle. "We are not in Germany." He then asked the same question in English. Still no answer. I followed the proceedings with great interest. "Is he dumb?" cried the professor, who, very proud of his multilingualism, then tried the same question in French. Continuing silence. "Let's try Italian then. Dove noi siamo?" "Yes, where are we?" I repeated, slightly impatiently. The boy said nothing. "Humph. Will you answer?" cried my uncle, who was getting annoyed and shaking the urchin by the ears. "Come si noma questa Zola." "Stromboli, 135," answered the little shepherd boy, escaping from Hans's grasp and running through the olive trees towards the plain. We weren't bothered about him. Stromboli. What an effect this unforeseen name produced on my mind. We were in the middle of the Mediterranean, surrounded by that Aeolian archipelago 136 of mythological memory, in that ancient strong isle where Aeolus held the winds and tempests on a chain. And those rounded blue hills to the east were the mountains of Calabria. And that volcano on the southern horizon was Etna, terrible Etna itself. Stromboli, Stromboli. I repeated. My uncle accompanied me with words and gestures. We were like a choir singing in unison. Oh, what a journey, what an amazing journey. We had gone in by one volcano and out by another, and this other was nearly 3,000 miles from Snæfellsnes, from the barren shores of Iceland and the outermost limits of the world. The hazards of our expedition had brought us to the heart of the most fortunate country on the globe. We had exchanged the lands of eternal snows for those of infinite greenery, and the grayish fogs of the freezing wastes above our heads had become the azure skies of Sicily. After a delightful meal of fruit and cool water, we set off again towards the port of Stromboli. It did not seem advisable to say how we had arrived on the island. With their superstitious mentality, the Italians would certainly have thought us devils thrown up by the fires of hell. We accordingly resigned ourselves to being mere victims of shipwreck. It was less glamorous, but safer. On the way I heard my uncle murmuring, "But what about the compass? It did point north. What can the reason be?" "Really," I said, with an air of great disdain. "It's much simpler not to have to explain it." "What? A professor at the Johanneum would be disgraced if unable to discover the reason for a phenomenon of the physical world." Thus speaking, my uncle, half naked, with his leather purse around his waist and settling his glasses on his nose, became once more the terrible professor of mineralogy. An hour after leaving the olive grove we arrived at the port of San Vincenzo, where Hans asked for his 13th week's wages. These were duly given him, together with heartfelt handshakes. At that moment, even if he did not share our very natural feelings, he at least gave in to a most unusual display of emotion. 135 Stromboli. The Strombolian type of eruption involves moderate, intermittent bursts of expanding gases. 136 Aeolian Archipelago, also known as the Aeoli or Lipari Islands, off Ne Sicily, Strong Isle, Cone, Latin name for Stromboli, Aeolus, king of storms and winds, inventor of sails. He touched our hands lightly with the tips of his fingers, and he smiled. 45 We have now come to the end of a tale which many people, however determined to be surprised at nothing, will refuse to believe. But I am armed in advance against human skepticism. The Stromboli fishermen received us with the kindness due to those who have undergone shipwreck. They provided food and clothing. On the 31st of August, after a wait of 48 hours, we were conveyed by a little Sparinara 137 to Messina, where a few days' rest helped us recover from our fatigue. On Friday the 4th of September, we boarded the Volturne, one of the French imperial postal packet boats, 138, and landed 3 days later in Marseille, our minds submerged in only one problem, that of the wretched compass. This inexplicable fact continued to seriously bother me. On the evening of the 9th of September we arrived in Hamburg. I will not attempt to describe Martha's amazement and Graubin's joy at our return. "Now that you're a hero, Axel," said my dear fiancé, "you will never need to leave me again." I looked at her. She was weeping and smiling at the same time. I leave to the imagination whether Professor Leidenbrock's homecoming produced a sensation in Hamburg. Thanks to Martha's indiscretions, the news of his departure for the center of the earth had spread through the whole world. People had refused to believe it, and when he returned, they still refused. However, the presence of Hans and a few items of news from Iceland slowly modified public opinion. Eventually my uncle became a great man, and myself the nephew of a great man, already something to be. Hamburg gave a civic banquet in our honor. There was a public meeting held at the Johanneum, where the professor told the story of our expedition, omitting only the episodes involving the compass. The same day, he deposited Saknussemm's document in the municipal archives, and expressed his deep regret that circumstances stronger than his will had not allowed him to follow the footsteps of the Icelandic explorer down to the very center of the earth. He was modest in his glory, and it did his reputation a great deal of good. So many honors made people jealous, of course. The professor received his share of envy, and since his theories, based on facts that were certain, contradicted the scientific doctrines of fire in the center, he and 137 Sparanera, a small rowing boat. 138 Volturne, French for Volturno, a river in Central Italy, site of a victory by Garibaldi in 1860. Volturne is also an anagram of verne, French imperial postal packet boats, one of the rare allusions in Verne's works to contemporary political events. Napoleon III had been emperor since 1852, gauged in some remarkable debates with scientists of every country, both in writing and in the flesh. As for myself, I personally cannot accept the theory of the cooling of the earth. Despite what I have seen, I believe, and always will, in heat at the center. But I admit that circumstances which are still not properly explained can sometimes modify this law under the effect of certain natural phenomena. At a moment when these questions were still being hotly discussed, my uncle experienced a real sadness. In spite of his entreaties, Hans decided to leave Hamburg. The man to whom we owed everything would not let us repay our debt. He was suffering from homesickness for Iceland. Farvel, he said one day, and with this simple goodbye, he left for Reykjavik, where he arrived safely. We were singularly attached to the excellent eider hunter. Although absent, he will never be forgotten by those whose lives he saved, and I will certainly see him one last time before I die. As a conclusion, I should perhaps say that this journey to the center of the earth created a sensation in the whole world. It was translated and published in every language. The most important newspapers competed for the main episodes, which were reviewed, discussed, attacked, and defended with equal fervor in the camps of both believers and unbelievers. Unusually, my uncle enjoyed during his lifetime all the fame he had won, and everyone, up to and including Mr. Barnum himself, offered to exhibit him in the entire United States, at an exceptional price. But a worry, which might almost be called a torment, slipped into this fame. A single fact remained unfathomable, that of the compass. Now for a scientist an unexplained fact is mental torture. But heaven intended my uncle to be completely happy. One day, while arranging a collection of minerals in his study, I noticed the much-discussed compass, and began to examine it again. It had been in its corner for 6 months, without suspecting the fuss it was causing. Suddenly I was flabbergasted. I shouted out. The professor came running. What is it? The compass. The needle points south, not north. What are you trying to say? See, the poles are reversed. Reversed. My uncle took a look, did a quick comparison, and then made the whole house shake with a superb aerial leap. What light shone in his mind and in mine! So, he cried when he could speak again, when we arrived at Cape Saknussem, the needle of this accursed compass showed south instead of north. Obviously. Then our mistake is explained. But what could have caused this reversal of the poles? Nothing simpler. Explain yourself clearly, my boy. During the storm on the Leidenbrock Sea, the fireball magnetized the iron on the raft and so quite simply disorientated our compass. Oh! Exclaimed the professor, then burst out laughing. So it was all a trick done by electricity. From that day onwards, my uncle was the happiest of scientists. I was the happiest of men, for my pretty Verland girl, giving up her position as ward, took on responsibilities in the house in Königstrasse as both wife and niece. There is little need to add that her uncle was the illustrious Professor Otto Leidenbrock, a corresponding member of every scientific, geographical, and mineralogical society in the 5 continents. The Independix Verne is seen by the critics 1. We have the good fortune to have to draw to our readers' attention a new and charming book by M. Jules Verne. The Sick Journey to the Center of the Earth, like 5 weeks in a Balloon and the British at the North Pole, original title of the first half of Captain Hatteras, combines the most solid scientific qualities with the amusement and interest of a drama and a tale. Young people and people of the world, les persons du monde, will not find a more agreeable and excellent guide than M. Verne to initiate them to geological discoveries and to the history, mysterious and so little known, of the Earth's massif on which we live. Stahl, pseudonym of Hetzel, publicity announcement in the Magazine d'Education et de Recreation. 2. This fictional journey has all the colors and movement of reality, and if the author had not taken the care to tell us himself, the illusion would be almost too complete. Jules Verne is a true scientist, a delightful storyteller and a writer of the greatest merit. Gustave Landel, 1864. 3. Journey to the Center of the Earth is phantasmagoric, but the reader is so caught up in Axel's anguish that the improbability of the events takes on secondary importance. Interior and exterior adventures are so closely interwoven that it is not until Axel has completed his final test that we emerge from the fiction and begin to wonder where the truth of the matter was. One feels that the book was Verne's escape into the world of dream, one that he was never to undertake again on this scale. Jean Jules Verne, 1973, trans, by Roger Greaves. 4. Lidenbrock conveys a new vision of space. What distinguishes 2 points now is how close or how far they are from the center. The corresponding map is a half line, where points situated at the same distance are indistinguishable. This accounts for Lidenbrock's behavior, the man of the perpendiculars, whose only wish is to slide down the Earth's rocky ooze, and for whom the worst torture is to have to navigate on that interior sea that we find so magnificent. Dominique Lacaze, 1979. 5. The particularity of the initiatory novel, when it is the work of a great writer, is to be both realistic and symbolic. It is the adventure nouvelle, however, that best lends itself to this spiritual transformation, and I have observed with astonishment that, while the great romantic novels have not been considered by the critics as initiatory works, those of Jules Verne have. If Baudelaire is Poe's brother, Verne is his half-brother. Léon Cellier, 1964. 6. Verne recycles the literary ocean depths, the Promethean challenge of the terrestrial forces, the quest for the Father. His scientists and explorers are nature's psychoanalysts. They unlock the ancient desires of the sleeping elements. Electricity liberates the earthly powers. And a scientific alchemy officiates at the perfect marriage between fire, water, earth and air. The fantastic forms a bottomless pit. Verne gives lessons in chasms. More poetic than scientific, he leaves his dreams a margin. His heroes don't land on the moon or reach the center of the earth. His conquerors of the impossible maintain that distance which allows the mysteries to be seen but not touched. He doesn't destroy our myths. J. Cabot, 1974. 7. The volcano participates doubly in Verne's binary topology of prominences and cavities. It is a hollow pyramid connecting the heavens with the underground inferno, and it is a two-way slip road onto the dual carriageway of human traffic leading into and out of the Earth's core. The Vernean law of reciprocity requires that not only should man urgently plumb the depths of the planet, but that the Earth's core should equally strain to escape from secrecy, burst through its fragile skin and so stand revealed in the sight of men. The volcano is the entrance to an inverted universe, and it preserves an imprint of that inversion, comprising a portion of the subterranean world violently everted and solidified, the abyss turned inside out by an explosion. Conversely, the outer world appears to have slipped inwards, in the shape of a gigantic cavern, equipped with its own Mediterranean and pseudo-firmament. Andrew Martin, 1985. 8. There are these sparks. Science and suspense. Say Ruhmkorff lamp, gutta percha, Snaefels are guncotton, and something happens. In the 19th century, the scholar-travelers of the unknown left on a quest for the Holy Grail. J. F. Held. 9. But if this detour, this journey belongs to the imaginary, there is another, very real, trajectory, the thread of the tale. The novel becomes itself through the journey. The two advance together. One can even argue that the novel is the real aim. When he comes back, Axel publishes his story. The book is both an imaginary journey to the center of the earth and a real journey to the center of the text. Daniel Compere, 1977. Some of these quotations were first cited by Simone Vierne, Jules Verne, Bolland, Fairs, 1986, to whom grateful acknowledgments are recorded here.